Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the biggest thing that comes from this really is uncertainty. I published a blog post a couple weeks ago, and you can see it in the web links on the platform there called COVID Costs. And I thought that the biggest cost for COVID beyond the finances was the loss of assumption, the loss of status quo. When you're talking about biopsychosocial spiritual, and I always had the spiritual component into it, not from a religious standpoint, but from a sense of purpose, more to life than just, the carbon and water combination of bodies that we are. But when you come into a COVID implication, an illness, you come in with psychosocial baggage. And that could be good, that could be for resilience, that could be that you've been an overcomer, you've been in difficult circumstances in the past, and yet you still were able to survive and even thrive. But then you can also have bad psychosocial baggage, things like catastrophization and perceived injustice. And those are two things that are really talked about from a behavioral psychology standpoint that really impedes clinical outcomes and impedes good clinical outcomes in general. And when you think about coronavirus, you can think about catastrophization, and that's a good self-defining term, right? It's this is the worst that's ever been visited on any human being, that I'm the worst ever. That when you give them a pain scale of 1 to 10, they say 473. So you come into it with catastrophizing attitude, COVID is going to have more negative implications potentially. And then the perceived injustice. Why did I get it and why didn't somebody else get it? I was at the same concert, I was at the same restaurant, and I got it, and woe is me and all that kind of stuff. So, people come into this illness with a variety of baggage, so to speak, from the biopsychosocial standpoint. And then as you were going through it, there's a bunch of stuff that happens. There's financial implications, there's professional implications, there's relational implications beyond the health. The question is, what is the new normal in society and in your own life after you exit this? Especially if you've been in ICU and you've been, completely away from everybody, and all you see is masks. You don't actually see human beings. We don't even know how long you're immune after recovery. That is still something that's being discovered. I read something recently that potentially when you have the antibodies, that you're potentially immune for up to 3 months. Well, I think everybody was hoping that you'd be immune for the rest of your life. So what does that have to do with, could this potentially come back to me? We don't necessarily know what the long-term implications are. Dr. Ashley talked about in terms of cardiovascular and neurological and different things, but we haven't been in it long enough to understand what the long-term implications are. And then you got this whole concept of having fought through it. If you survive having gone through contracting COVID and being in the ICU and maybe being on the ventilator or whatever and being isolated, you have a tremendous fight mentality. You were able to overcome that. Well, what if your fight's all done? What if you used up all your fight during that point? And once you get past that, then other scenarios come up, other crises come up, and now you're more of a flight or freeze kind of person. So you got all these things that are going on. And then, in conjunction, maybe while you're in there, you lost somebody, maybe someone that died, maybe from COVID, maybe not from COVID. You weren't able to say goodbye to them. You weren't able to attend the funeral because funerals are outlawed, basically. You survived, but at, what cost? So there's another blog post, again, in the web forums that I published a couple weeks ago called Survive in Advance. And it's really the story about the North Carolina State basketball team that won the NCAA Final Four back in 1984. And Coach Valvano, in his speech about 10 years after that, as he was battling cancer, and he was talking about how much they learned from one another during that process, and they overcome a lot of obstacles. And he talked about in this kind of retrospective, as he was battling cancer and ultimately would die from it, he talked about psychological flexibility and resilience. And one of my favorite phrases, and I'm a little biased since I wrote it, but they created their own momentum. So what that basketball team, they had a lot of obstacles, they had a lot of issues that came about, but they looked inside and they created their own momentum. And that's really what the term is called, self-efficacy. And I'm going to drop two names with you. Dr. Mark Ashley mentioned it in the opening video, but two things that you should be aware of, and maybe Google once you're done with this, not while you're watching our panel, obviously, but self-efficacy and neuroplasticity. Both of those are really, really important. Self-efficacy is the fact that you take ownership, you've got locus of control, you can manage this, you can navigate this, and you're doing everything you're losing weight, you're doing the steps, you're eating better nutrition, you're practicing mindfulness, you're doing yoga and stretching, things that don't require somebody or something else to do something to you, which oftentimes the biomedical model has kind of outsourced as individuals. We've outsourced our health care to somebody or something else, a pill, a procedure, a doctor to take care of it, when there's a lot of things that we can do. And when you look at COVID complications, comorbidities, obesity is one big one, pun intended, right? That's a large issue. Well, if you're obese, there's something you can do about that, right? So there's things within our control that we should do that. And then the other term that you might want to Google if you're not familiar with is neuroplasticity, where we're constantly, moment by moment, from the moment we're born until the moment we die, our brain is constantly changing biologically, literally, physically changing. And you can lay new neural pathways, either for the good or the bad. And so what you want to be doing is engaging neuroplasticity and trying to engage and create those neural pathways, whether it's by rote exercise and habit and repeated tasks, or thinking positively and getting rid of the negative thoughts, all those different things. So, to sum it up, from a biopsychosocial standpoint, if you've been through COVID, you probably got more questions at the end than you have answers. And that messes with your mind, not the mind that Dr. Matt talked about, but the mind as in, oh my gosh, what's next? And that's almost as dangerous and as difficult and as challenging as physical, biological, neurological issues.
Yeah,